Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Keeping Commitments Going Beyond Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage and Mental Health Awareness Month in the Workplace. My name is Kaila Brooks, and I'm thrilled to be co-moderating this conversation today. At Canaries, I'm a DEI client champion, and I work with clients to identify opportunities for improvement through the lens of DEI and implement DEI metrics to help them track their progress with data. Alongside me guiding this discussion is my fellow Canaries team member, Amin Habibnia. Over to you. Amin is on mute.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amin Habibnia. I joined Canaries as an account executive and serve as the diversity, equity, and inclusion client champion for our clients that are creating and maintaining a more productive workplace. I enjoy working with folks at different stages in their respective DEI journeys, those that are earlier in their journey and want to learn from other organizations who've already taken the lead. And further, I enjoy working with leadership teams at more mature organizations that are properly utilizing the vast empirical data, which shows that DEI improves companies' bottom line. As Kaila mentioned, today's conversation will center around AAPI inclusivity in the workplace and beyond, but also to the importance of mental health this month. Joining us today to guide the conversation are our expert panelists, Carissa Begonia, Tiffany Foo, and Tizita Seifu.
Carissa Begonia is a first-generation Filipino-American daughter of immigrants. She's the former head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Zappos and currently a business leadership coach and founder of Conscious Exchange, an equity-focused coaching and consulting company with a mission to forward the social and economic advancement of racialized communities. She is also a certified coach in emotional intelligence and has worked featured in Time magazine, including AA Rise, Asian American Racialized Identity and Social Empowerment for AAPIs, a program and community focused on justice and liberation for all, centering Asian American activist history, AAPI experiences, emotional processing, and somatic healing. We're very honored to have you join us today, Carissa.
We also have culture crafter and founder of Elemental, Tiffany Foo, joining us today from the unceded lands of the Washoe people. Prior to starting her fractional people leader and people consulting strategy firm, Tiffany served as K-Poor's Capital First Talent and Culture Director. Forged in the fires of early stage startups, Tiffany has led people operations, designed equity-informed talent infrastructure, and developed community programs to level the playing field in tech. Outside of her digital office life, Tiffany is devoted to high alpine mountain terrains and is committed to making nature more accessible to all. Her explorations, both personal and professional, are inspired by wisdom traditions, animated by equity and inclusion principles, and motivated by love and wellness. It is our privilege to hear from Tiffany's perspective throughout this panel.
We're also joined by Tizita Seifu. Tizita is a therapist, speaker, and writer with 10 years of experience providing cultural and spiritual inclusive therapy and mental health education locally and globally so that you can experience the peace and success of living as your truest self. She's a state board licensed professional counselor in Texas, Virginia, and Georgia. Tizita is a clinical coordinator with Harmony Community Development Corporation, which is an agency focused on strengthening families and revitalizing neighborhoods in Dallas. Welcome to the panel, and we're excited to hear from you.
You can expect each speaker to have the floor for about 10 minutes for each question, and we'll conduct a short Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A window. We'll address them during the Q&A portion.
By the end of our time here today, we hope you feel more comfortable and confident in your knowledge around AAPI, heritage, and mental health topics and how they relate to our well-being and belongingness in the workplace. We're very passionate about diversity, equity, inclusion topics and have many stories and learnings to share here today.
To begin today's conversation, we'll start with Carissa, and both Tiffany and Tizita can chime in. Hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are rising at an alarming rate. According to the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 339% in 2021. Harvard Business Review published an article in March 2022 outlining that Because of this stark increase in racism and xenophobia, members of the AAPI community are scared to come to work because they don't feel safe. My question is, what are some specific ways we can support AAPI colleagues and employees in the workplace and other groups may not realize or know about? How should company leaders address those challenges?
Thanks, Min. And first, before we start, I just wanted to shout out my fellow Filipinos on this Zoom screen today. And the reason I share that is that often, even for specific Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, there's a underrepresentation, if you will, of Filipinos, Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians on panels, on, in speaking engagements and workshops and such in this month. And so I just wanted to shout that out and say it was an honor to learn that there's some Filipinos representing here today. So that's exciting. And to answer your question, I think one of the shocking things that I've been experiencing in some of the conversations I've been having with companies is a question of, are hate crimes still happening? Is Asian hate still a thing? And I'll say that it was a little triggering to be asked that question alone. And so that's something that I think people aren't realizing that. And I think the intention of that question is not necessarily that to be dismissive or to be like, to downplay what's going on. It's really, hopefully, like, we don't want to see this happening anymore, right? But it is. And just because it's not hitting and national news every single day, maybe something to be aware of are the news outlets that maybe more APIs are seeing, like, that we pay attention to, like Neck Shark or Jackfruit or something. So because where we are seeing crimes happening, it is every day, right? And this is maybe getting publicity, since the pandemic. It's risen certainly since the pandemic, but a lot of what we've experienced in terms of racism, this has been happening for decades, if not centuries, right? And it's just coming to light. So that question alone is something I would avoid, right? And because, and maybe replace that question more so with, how are you doing? It sounds so simple and basic, but we're not asking those questions often, and especially in these hybrid environments, maybe fully remote environments, when we're not just passing each other and making niceties in the hallways like we used to in organizations or in our offices. You have to be more intentional about that, and not just getting on a Zoom meeting and asking and just getting to it. But certainly, I think something that we might not be seeing or expressing, Tiffany and I were talking a little bit about wanting to center experiences of Asian Americans and how are we feeling? I'm actually really curious for the folks who might be AAPI identifying in this room today or in the chat today, drop in the chat, how are you feeling, right? And maybe that's just eye-opening to see that oftentimes it's like, I'm feeling scared, or I'm feeling nervous, or I don't want to take the train to work anymore, right? I don't want to come into the office because any little slight of even, some kind of comment, it's hurtful, and I think another thing that people don't realize is that racialized trauma, we carry that. I don't know, Tizita, maybe you can speak more to this in terms of how people deal with trauma and mental wellness, but my first experience with and understanding my racial identity happened when I was 9, and my first experience when I was 9, and I'll tell you, a lot of my journey has been unpacking what that one experience has done and how my behavior has been adapted because of that experience. So it doesn't leave us, right? And so to kind of be aware that, for racialized folks, we probably had something happen to us at some point in our lives. Some of us have processed it, some of us have not, right? And even if we have done a lot of work around it, you don't know at what point you might be triggered by something. And just for example, on this, I was giving a talk at Johns Hopkins University a couple of weeks ago, and the topic I brought up, the very recent news of Michelle Go and Christina Lee in New York City, which is where I'm originally from, and the commute that I had going to work was very similar to Michelle Go's, and to hear those tragic news triggered me in that call where I am giving a presentation, I'm tearing up, right? And so I don't know when that's coming. And certainly I think something for folks to understand is that, again, just because you might not see it doesn't mean it's not something that I still experience day to day, right? Or feel, even maybe nothing like happens, I might feel that, especially in the line of work that I do as a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner. This is something that I'm speaking about daily, right? And so I think to be sensitive to Asian Americans, especially at that time, that a better question than like, are the crimes like stopping? Which again, I know the intention is we don't want to see our colleagues hurting, our friends, or family members hurting anymore. But why don't we ask, like, how actually are you feeling? What's going on? And that might be received with just joyful news. And I celebrated with my family and had a wonderful Sunday dinner yesterday, or I'm feeling kind of scared, because I saw something happen again yesterday on this news outlet, and I don't have an outlet to speak to somebody about it. So thank you for asking. So something simple as that. I'm sure my friends here and colleagues here have other things to offer.
I agree, and +1 to everything Carissa said. What I want to do is address, like, what can allies and leadership in companies do? And I don't like prescriptions, but I do like guiding principles. And to make it super easy for folks, think of it in terms of the 5 professional love languages, because I think a lot of us are socialized to that. So number 1, words of affirmation. Acknowledge what happened. I saw on the news, or I was horrified to hear, fill in the blank. Number 2, quality time. Make space for sharing at the beginning of meetings, all hands, one-on-ones, seeing someone on the Zoom screen or in the office if we're doing that again. And invite the opportunity to speak. Some people don't want to speak and share, but others may. And if that time is offered, that can help. Next, acts of service. Let's reduce or redistribute labor and emotional burden. And so some of my colleagues were like, hey, do you want me to handle this? Or this meeting's not really essential. We don't need to have that meeting right now. And then gifts. So people sent me DoorDash credits or Uber Eats because they were like, you don't need to think about how you're going to feed yourself. Let us help. And food always helps. And then the last one, what is it? It's touch. Obviously not touch because professionalism here, but creating space for having more connection, whether that's a API only session with an external facilitator, whether that's an entire company-wide session, but creating spaces for processing. I think that's really important. And the last thing I'll just say is that companies are constantly asking or telling folks to bring their whole selves to work. But what does that really, really mean? That means that companies need to recognize that people's lives are impacted outside of the workplace. And when we made that shift for a lot of us to remote work, that meant the barriers between the professional, the personal, and the public all kind of shifted. And now my work is in my home and my colleagues are in my home in a very different way. And so that needs to be acknowledged too. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Tiffany, Carissa. Thank you, everyone, for having me. My name is Tizita. I'm so glad to be having this intentional conversation. And I appreciate, Carissa, that you're already leading with transparency. I know that is not easy, but I know that people are being blessed because of it. I would first of all say, get to know the individuals on your team, right? What helps? Get to know the individuals, even if we are one race or we are definitely having our own experience, right? So I'll give you an example. My parents are from Ethiopia, which is in East Africa. I've never lived there, right? And so defining my identity is confusing for a lot of people, right? We know the question of like, where are you from? Okay, so I'm from Dallas, but that is often confusing for people to hear, right? And so I would say get to know the individuals. A single race is not a single culture, right? So I am Black as a daughter of the African diaspora, but I am also not African American, right? So I remember talking to an African American volunteer, and he said, "Have you ever had chitlins?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Have you ever had pig's feet?" I said, "No." And he said, "Are you Black?" And I put my hand on my hip. I said, "Yeah, I'm Black." "Have you ever had kutful?" He was like, "What's that?" "Have you ever had dodo wet?" He was like, "What's that?" I said, "That's Ethiopian food." He's like, "Okay, okay, your hand is on your hip. Okay, I see you're Black. Okay, I get it, I get it." I said, I was like, okay, I'm not sure the hand on my hip defines my Blackness, but my point to him was Blackness is many cultures, right? So the goal in supporting your team members is get to know their individual experiences. It's not about expecting an individual to speak for the whole, right? It's about getting to know and consider the individuals on your team and their individual experiences.
Thank you each for sharing about bringing your authentic self to work, the barriers that may be in place, and some helpful tools that we can all utilize. As you know, many employers focus on what changes need to be made whilst at work. However, we know that change should happen outside of it. For this next question, I want to pose to Tiffany, and the other panelists, of course, are welcome to chime in. What needs to happen outside of the workplace so coworkers and employees are able to show allyship in the workplace? And how does storytelling and Healing Story Project contribute to these needs?
I'm so glad I'm able to talk about that right now. I guess first and foremost, I just want to say that I want everyone, as Carissa already mentioned, to understand that none of what is happening now with the 11,000 plus reported hate crimes logged by the Stop AAPI hate group in the last 2 years is new. None of this is new. It's not like we just started being victimized or victims of racialized violence. These roots go back to the origins of AAPI in America. And for me, the Storytelling is Healing project is really recognizing that healing, reclaiming your voice, and taking up space is interdependent community work. We are not self-made, but community-made, forged by family situations and experiences and the circumstances that have informed it all. And so as all of us here on the panel are immigrants or the children of immigrants, it's important to remember that the way that we were raised are coping mechanisms for our parents, for our ancestors, for being in a country or in a society that perpetually othered us and made us foreigners all of the time. So as an example, I'm a 5th or 4th generation Chinese American. My family's been here a significant amount of time. And just like Tizita, I regularly get asked, just where are you really from? Or go back to where you came from. At the beginning of the pandemic, literally in March of 2020, I was walking down the street in Oakland, California, downtown Oakland, and a white woman came up to me and started screaming at me and called me a bitch and told me to go back to where I belonged. She said, my uncle fought people like you in the war. You don't deserve to be here. And a bunch of other Kung Flu related things. But that is not new. This is part of my larger ancestral story, going back to my great grandfather, who was an herbalist, who was in this country. And my grandmother told me at least 5 different times they got chased out of the town that they were in. And this was all across the West. And they got chased out by mainly the preacher and the town doctors who raised mobs. And so my grandma would come home from school and the family would be packed and like needing to get out of town. And this even is not new, because then we can look at the historical underpinnings of the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which literally denied my great grandfathers from being able to come into this country, to bring their families back into this country. And so this otherness, the perpetual foreignness, has been there since the very beginning. And I want everyone to know that what is happening now is not new. So the Storytelling is Healing project was created to really center the breadth and the range of what it means to be Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander. Side note, the acronym just continues to get longer, and I really wish there was an easier way to encompass it all while still being inclusive and recognizing the diversity of all of our experiences, but that does not seem to be the case. So with this project, we want to personalize both what is happening now as well as what we're feeling and currently experiencing, while also recognizing that the racial violence, the xenophobia, the racism, the misogyny, the othering, and the dehumanization have always been part of the story. And because invisibility is also a common theme for APIs, this is an opportunity to center and amplify all of these voices. And I think someone hopefully dropped the link into the chat. If not, I'll do it again, but I encourage everyone to check out the story. If you are of AAPI descent, I invite and welcome you to share your voice matters and to add to the collection so that we can show, number one, as Tizita said, this is a very diverse subgroup of people coming from 60 plus different countries or island nations, and not all of our experiences are the same. So thank you.
I would just say, and for the sake of time, I'll be really brief. What needs to happen in terms of allyship, if you're aware of the implications and the current day impact of racism, you understand concepts of negative bias and positive bias. So to those that are on the side of receiving positive bias in your spaces, use that positive bias to affect positive change for those that experience negative bias. That would be my one offer to that question.
I'll chime in before Amin takes over, and just that's the next question. To Tizita's point, using your positive bias to, reach out and support others who have more of a negative bias, divesting from privilege, essentially, educating yourself on what that positive bias is in the society. Because anyone that comes to me and presents as an ally, there's still initial mistrust, because I'm not sure what that means to you. And I'm not sure if you're going to ask me to educate you. And I don't feel that that is acting as an ally when the responsibility and the burden is placed on me to potentially share triggering, traumatizing experiences to convince you that I need your help or your action in this cause. So that's all I will say. And over to me.
Can I just jump in and say something too? Like,
Please.
So whether we're talking about the recent Roe v. Wade implosion, or whether we're talking about the fact that more APIs got shot over the weekend, I sit with is my pain public fodder for just the masses in this social media focused world? And I've seen a lot of women share their stories regarding abortion and a woman's right to choose. And I've sat with that. Do they, because really we're doing it in the hopes of hopefully, number one, swaying a public opinion, but then number two, to show how more pervasive this is. And I sit with do they deserve to know that much about me and my pain or my trauma? And that was also a consideration as we were thinking through the Storytelling is Healing project. But we decided, as Bell Hooks said, your silence does not protect you. So that's where I'm landing here.
Thank you all for opening up. Carissa, is there anything that you would like to share on this topic before we make sure to spend a few minutes on mental health as well.
Maybe just to segue into the mental health topic is, just hearing some of the stories, Tiffany, of what you were sharing, I was getting activated, right? I was feeling a little teary myself. And so I think this is what I was saying earlier about we don't know when something's going to trigger us, right? We don't know people's stories. And so when they're automatically assumed to be one way, right? To be told, go back to your country, I've been here. This is my country, been here for 4 or 5 generations, it's hurtful and it's painful, and think about even just the experiences in the United States, about that question alone, like, where are you from, or go back to your country. It's like, you don't think part of maybe some of the history of the Philippines, right? It's like the colonization from Spanish and from the US, right? And US imperialism. So like, there's reasons why we are also here as first, second gen immigrants, or fourth, fifth gen, right? And so I think understanding that we're a global, this is a global issue, right? And it's not just what's happening in the United States and our experience in the United States and being told to go home. It's like, I might be here for a reason, right? Just like all of us are, actually. So I don't know. I think bigger point is just feeling a little activated. And I think something for folks to know, both allies and folks who are AAPI identifying here, right, are to acknowledge those emotions. And I'm really excited for Tizita to go and talk maybe more about, mental health and wellness, because I think that's such an important conversation to have, aside from just, I think in the Asian conversation, representation and leadership, what about wellness, and our well-being.
Thank you all. And just in full transparency here, if we weren't willing to open up ourselves as a group in preparation for today's panel, we wouldn't have known that we had so much Filipino heritage here by multiple host panelists and the audience as well. So we have to remember that we have folks that check in on us, not because they have to, but because they want to. But we also need to extend that and check in on people, whether we have history with them or not. It's just that caring hand, that caring eye contact, or that phone call out of the blue. So we encourage those that are involved in today's conversation, or those silent leaders at your respective organizations. If someone isn't taking that first step, if you don't feel like you can make that first step, you can take that first step with us. And then we'll see if we can help assist in any way we can through some of the best practices we've deployed with some of our other clients that have also helped try to make these conversations a little less difficult. As we shift today's conversation to also include mental health in the workplace, many of you will know that Harvard Business Review described in the 2021 article that, quote, one silver lining amid all the current disruption and trauma is the normalization of mental health challenges at work. And according to a 2021 national survey conducted by McKinsey & Company, it was found that 65% of employers reported that mental health is supported well or very well. However, only 51% of all employee respondents agree. So my question for Tizita and the group is, how does a company effectively implement mental health resources in the workplace? And what are the downfalls of not properly prioritizing mental health?
I'm so glad you asked the question. Much like several people have shared, I too felt teary-eyed when Tiffany was sharing, and I just want to switch my points around to take care of us in the here and now. So as a person of color, if you are being triggered now or at any point, I just want to encourage us to find safe spaces to process the impact of our experiences, right? And to take breaks. So even here and now, if it's getting overwhelming, you can step away and come back. This is being recorded, right? We have to take care of ourselves and engage in a way that's manageable. Do what you can to support the cause, but also make sure that you are assessing how it's affecting your mental health. Monitor how it's affecting your mental health, because we need to, it's a long journey, right? It's unfortunately going to likely outlive our lifetimes. And so we need to keep this manageable. And so the first thing I would say is just taking care of ourselves. I would also say intentionally set aside time to assess if and how you are engaging a priority of culturally and racially inclusive mental health for you and your staff. Assess, right? Regularly assess. Set the tone, especially as leaders, for a culture that values mental health, right? You set the tone more by your example than by your words. Because people won't really believe us until we are showing that we are living it out. So as a leader, as a team member, are you generally maintaining healthy work-life balance? Right? Do you regularly engage in acts of self-care? Do you work at a healthy pace? Do you generally keep a reasonable workload? Right? Just check in with yourself from time to time, even those questions. If there wasn't a clear yes, then it's going to be hard to really pass down, as we're talking about how do we effectively encourage mental health and share resources. It's got to come from our lived example. I also would say intentionally develop a relationship with a diverse group of therapists, diverse in culture, diverse in race, diverse in spirituality, to offer insurance referral options for employee assistance programs and network providers. I can't tell you how many times folks will tell me they're struggling to find providers covered in their insurance that meet their racial and cultural needs. And so they end up feeling like they have to leave a part of them behind. What happens? This is exactly the reason I became a therapist. I used to work with the refugee and immigrant community, and it was very difficult to find providers that were of similar culture. And so it made it take longer for them to benefit from therapy, and it often created a disconnect, right? I'm not saying that a therapist that's culturally sensitive and trained can't be helpful, but oftentimes it does create a disconnect and a lag in time to benefit. And so employees often find it easier to connect and relate to a provider with a similar racial cultural background, and include diversity in those providers that mirrors the diversity of your staff, your clients. Also, I would say vet your insurance company to ensure that you're paying comparable rates to culturally inclusive therapists. Many insurance companies are not keeping pace with industry standards of compensation. Ask your staff regarding their topics of interest when it relates to mental health. Don't necessarily assume that you know. Receive the feedback through various and regular communication methods. So it could be in your one-on-ones. As we know, we may be more comfortable with indirect communication. And so put out some truly anonymous surveys as well, right? So people are not afraid of possible punitive action. Support, and this is critical, support and do not merely delegate the work of creating a culture of mental health and diversity. This is everybody's job, right? For it to truly shift, for the culture to truly shift and be more mentally healthy and culturally inclusive, it has to be a collaborative effort. Understand the effects of racism, past and present, and how it has adversely affected the mental health of many people of color, right? We're hearing it here, not just things of the past. I can say even in the last 2 years, I can't tell you how many personally and how many clients, it wasn't even presenting issue, but things that have happened even like we're talking about today, and with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, that there's still rippling effects, that fatigue, right? So understand the effects of racism and the adverse effects to mental health. Do, as it was said here, and I'll just reiterate it this way, do not expect your Asian, your people of color employees, many of whom are mentally fatigued by past and present experiences of racism, to do the heavy lifting of creating company-wide diversity or mental health. resources and professionals are already available to come into your understanding about the problems, your understanding about how to be part of the solution. Books, trainings, documentaries, professionals who specialize in the work, who have already created trainings and education. Leverage these resources and do so regularly. A couple of more points. So in terms of the downfall to your question, I mean, if we don't do this, we will experience lack of energy, lack of motivation, reduced focus, fatigue, decreased engagement, sadness, anxiety, burnout, disengaged team members. But the benefits of doing so is we will experience increased energy, motivation, enjoyment, creativity, innovation, improved mood, peace, fulfillment, and ability to define and engage healthy boundaries. So as you model that, also the last thing I'll say is create a supportive and non-punitive culture for prioritizing mental health, such as PTO days to include mental health care, right? Going to your therapy session, and not only in a reactive way, but proactive. I don't have to be completely burned out to take a mental health day. It could just be, I'm just a bit taxed. Normalize that, encourage that, support that. Those are some thoughts.
I wanted to share some things that we could do also that don't necessarily have to directly go towards therapy, right? I think there's as individuals, we can also have ability to self-regulate, you know? And so something I was really adamant about when I was head of diversity at Zappos was implementing or having people develop skills of emotional intelligence, right? And that first piece of emotional intelligence that we learn is self-awareness. And so that self-awareness is really broken down into naming your emotions and recognizing patterns in our behavior. And the third one, and naming emotions or self-awareness is also inclusive of like somatics, right? So feeling and naming where we're feeling this in our bodies, right? Because our bodies are so wise. And oftentimes you can walk in a room and your stomach will start churning and already you have information about something's going on for you, right? Maybe you're nervous about to present at a conference or whatnot. Maybe there's someone who makes you really uncomfortable and maybe you haven't named that yet, but your body already knows and is already distancing yourself from maybe a group of folks. That's all information data, and that's what we're learning with EQ, right? And because sometimes therapy is not accessible, right? Like Tizita was talking about how, culturally sensitive therapists there's not enough, and so what can we do for ourselves as well? And so that I was really, these skills about, again, EQ, just again, the simple act of naming what we're experiencing and not just happy, sad, mad, right? Like more specific, there's something out there if you want to Google the wheel of emotions, right? To help you more accurately name the experience, right? I might be feeling shame or, and that might be manifesting though in itself in a meeting as anger and lashing out, right? But what I'm really actually experiencing is fear, and so that alone, that act alone allows us to kind of start out that processing, and then in the process of EQ too, like besides naming that, moving towards an ability to choose how we want to respond to something rather than be reactive is also wildly helpful, right? And so that's some tips I would say, just like the structural systemic things that we could do are offering policies and changes and on resources and such as an organization. But even, again, this culture of awareness of self, and then what that awareness of self can also do is create more empathy for someone else, right? Me sharing that I'm getting like upset about Tiffany's story, and kind of naming that I'm having that experience is helping to regulate myself, my body as well. But also to share that I acknowledge you, Tiffany, about that is something that is hard, right? And so that's again, that dialogue, that communication, understanding self, be able to be more empathetic and compassionate if I'm experiencing that, I wonder what Tiffany might be experiencing as the bearer of that and the teller of that story, you know, and that we also, kind curiosity is probably another kind of thing that I would lead with, and understand that people to be curious about what might be happening for someone. So maybe we miss a deadline. Instead of asking a question of, where is this, you know, Kaila, like, where's the report that was supposed to be on my desk at 9 a.m. this morning? Maybe leading with a different question of like, hey, you normally, like, what's going on, right? That's not a regular behavior of yours. And so it's kind of like, maybe something happened, as opposed to blame, right? And so those are just some other tips I would say that isn't only, we don't have to only say that these the one modality we have is therapy, right? And also offering other modalities, right? Things like breath work, or movement based like modalities, right? There's a plethora of ways people can heal, and take care of their wellness and mental health. And I think too often we rely on another person, a therapist, to help fix us. And there's definitely other ways in which we can also take responsibility for that. And to understand that individual responsibility is something we do collectively as well.
Thank you both for sharing different resources. To tie your points together, my therapist doesn't focus on cognitive behavioral therapy. She focuses on somatics and body work. And so that was new for me, because I definitely had a view of therapy as talk therapy only. And so when I was introduced to breath work in my sessions, at first I was a bit shocked and not necessarily excited to try out these tips and tricks, but it's done great things for me. So thank you both for sharing those resources. For our next
art, music, and nature, right? All those are all accessible as well. So just to offer other resources.
Thank you. For our next discussion point, we turn to an article from USA Today published in April 2022, outlining how Asian Americans, specifically Asian women, are shut out of leadership at America's top companies. Asian women are half as likely as white women to be executives, on par with Black and Latinx Hispanic women. Also, the article describes Asian women as often seen as too differential and submissive to run business lines or companies. Before I get to the question, I just want to state, as having Asian women in my family, this was very shocking to read, because I do not describe them as submissive, quiet at all, very outspoken. And so my perception was very different when reading this article, and surprising. But my question for the group is, how do we begin to improve representation of Asian Americans in top leadership positions? And what are some steps we can start taking immediately to have an impact in the future?
First, I just have like an allergic reaction to all of this. The hyperfeminization of Asian women, I don't think can be separated from also the model minority stereotype. So as someone, you can't see unless you've met me, but I am not 5 feet tall. I am in my 40s. And so I have been struggling with the not authoritative, not old enough, not experienced enough, not enough presence to be in a leadership position my entire life. And I agree, Kaila. I am not like, I present really big. I share my feelings often, but in my first startup, the CEO literally said to my face, I can't make you head of people because you're just too young and that wouldn't look right. Side note, I was older than him. In fact, I was like the second oldest person in the company at that time, but he assumed I was 24. Add like 10 plus years to that, dude. And he didn't think from an optics perspective or from the fact that I like was super casual and how I showed up that I deserved to be head of people, even though I was effectively doing that job. And that's just one incidence of like the stereotyping and the bias that comes into place, tied to the submissive stereotype of Asian women, or the Asians are not leadership material. They're not assertive enough, authoritative enough, etc. And I think in terms of tactics, Inequity is always surfaces in the absence of standardization, clarity, and systems. And so I would invite all companies to look at what are their promotion schedules, what are their performance management systems, and how systematized are they? Because so much of what we perceive in terms of can someone do this job are tied to biases. They're not actually tied to performance capabilities. And when you have standards and systems in place, it's much harder to fall back and lean into our biases or the optics of things. So I'll stop there. Oh, side note, I did become head of people, but it took like 3 other people letting him know that I was actually like 35 at the time and not 24 as he had thought. And to let him know she's actually just doing everything that a head of people would be. So other thing for all of us, allies help. Allies are great and they help amplify the message.
And it's important to share that. So thank you, Tiffany, because there's probably lots of other stories that if we opened it up, we wouldn't be surprised, but it's important that folks do have a chance to share that at some point. And you started that conversation, so thank you. With respect to time, I want to make sure that we don't miss out on any questions that the audience has already put in the chat for us. We can make this more of an open Q&A. Irene in the chat asked if there are specific resources for learning self-regulation as an individual and in groups. That way, when she's triggered, she wants to know what y'all have already deployed either for yourself or Tizita for your clients specifically, if you've been able to help them in that journey. And let's see where this conversation goes. But thank you very much for asking that question. If anyone else has anything in the chat or in the Q&A, please feel free to do that now as well.
Irene, I'm excited for you that you notice that you're dysregulated, which is the opposite of self-regulation, because a lot of times we don't even notice this happening. So you're already halfway there. The fact that you recognize that there's a storm inside of you. And for example, on my IG and Facebook pages that you can find by my name, I have an exercise that walk you through about how to use your body and your mind to create a state of calm. And so I know it can feel disorienting, but breath work can help kind of trick the mind and the body to feel more safe. And so resources like that, grounding activities, there are great apps as well, like the, I'll pull up some of mine, the Abide app, the health app that kind of take you through self-regulation activities. So those are some thoughts.
I know one of mine, so I'm a very forceful person. So some of my activities, aside from maybe like, again, naming emotions, right? Kind of noticing what's going on in my body. I know I've heard maybe a practice called like box breathing, right? So some of that works. And as a very physical person, I mean, and my default sometimes reaction is maybe defaults towards anger, you know, so to be like air punch, you know, things screaming into a pillow, like some of these kind of embodiment exercises that I was learning also, you know, like Kaila, when my somatic coach was telling me how to maybe channel some energy elsewhere and not towards verbally towards people maybe, right? I was like, what is this? This is ridiculous, right? Like making animal noises, right? Shaking like animals do, right? When they're like kind of, when there's tension. So those are like, that's why I offer things like even dance. And even if that's just jumping up and down in your house and like, again, moving some of that energy through your body. So I'll just offer some of those other ways that it's, sometimes they're quiet, they're more meditative, breath work, meditation, right? But some of the movement-based kind of activities that I've been learning also, as someone who is, you know, maybe more physical, likes to take a lot more space, have been wildly helpful.
Thank you,
I will say my piece on this. I went to see a movie called Everywhere, Everything, All at Once. And I found that movie, it's an Asian American movie, so I encourage you to see it. It's amazing. But I found it to be very overstimulating for me. And when I left, I could feel that I was dysregulated. I had a lot of anxiety, I had a lot of emotions, and I didn't know how to process them. My friend felt the same way. So we went to my home and we turned on music, some of our favorite songs for dancing, and we just danced crazy and just shook our bodies until we were exhausted. And then we felt better and were able to sit and talk a little bit and watch something more peaceful. And so that's an activity I do to regulate, just because feelings are energy and they need to be expressed. And we live in a culture where expressing your emotions in public is still not acceptable or encouraged. And so definitely finding those people who can be those safe places for you to do this with, and then feeling comfortable to do it on your own as well.
I also wanted to add a reframe. Sometimes when we're upset, it can feel disorienting. And I encourage you to think about, instead of what's wrong with me, what happened to me, right? So when we're getting dysregulated, when we're upset, it can feel like our first mind might be, oh, what is wrong with me? Why am I upset? But the truth is, the question is really what happened to me. And this is where therapy can be helpful. Yes, we can help ourselves. And yet therapists have received extensive training to also help expedite that, help carry the burden. And it's kind of like the difference between catching water out of a leaking bucket at times versus sealing the bucket, right? So as we stay curious about what's happened to us, we might be able to seal the leak so that we don't keep getting triggered and dysregulated by certain things.
That's quite helpful. With the 5-minute warning we have left in our time today, Tiffany, I want to open it up to you if you want to speak directly to the AAPI professionals and allies in the community, making sure that we don't just honor and respect the cultures during this month, as well as recognize the importance of mental health. How do you want to speak to your people?
Ooh, big question, Amin. First, I just want to tag on to what we were talking about previously, emotion. To me, that's really evolutionary motion. And so all of the practices that everyone has offered here, I agree with. I do Kung Fu. I'm very physical as well. And sometimes just screaming helps. But looking ahead, because yeah, centering API issues and voices doesn't end when May ends. Tactically, next month is LGBTQ plus Awareness Month or Pride Month. So I would invite folks who are already thinking about that to ensure that their panels, their events are intersectional. There are queer APIs, there are queer Latine and Latinx folks, etc. So think about intersectionality throughout. In addition, I know that Ramadan just ended, and I saw, I can't remember what big Fortune 1000 company did it, but they provided meals and sent them out to all of their Muslim employees. And I think these are ways where you are demonstrating care and concern throughout the year. Sometimes it's tied to cultural holidays like Ramadan, like Lunar New Year. And then other times it's just thinking about the intersectionality and other ways where you can ensure that representation in all events throughout the year is inclusive. And then as a side note, I know Carissa can speak to this because she's still getting inquiries and we're already in the month of May, but like, wow, don't just wait to the last minute, y'all, and be like, oh shit, it's APAHM, we have to do something now. That to me demonstrates a lack of longer term commitment and concern, and that you weren't being strategic about your process up front. It's all positive.
Thank you. Tiffany, thank you. Carissa, thank you. Tizita, thank you to everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Keeping Commitments going beyond Asian American and Pacific Islander heritage and Mental Health Awareness Month in the workplace. And thank you all for tuning in.
We hope this conversation was educational and receptive. Please be sure to visit us at canaries.com and follow Canaries on all social media channels at Canaries Inc. to learn more. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.